salt is many things, but not necessarily something you'd associate specifically with Japan. Regardless, salt is a universal human need, and as such, different cultures have found different ways to produce it. Today, we're going to have a look at how Japan did, how that changed through the ages, and which cultural significance it has today. When you ask most people how to add salt flavor to Japanese dishes, they will probably default to soy sauce. Soy sauce, which originated in China, is indeed a very salty condiment and was originally used as a way to stretch out salt. Since soy sauce also has a strong umami flavor, which is a flavor enhancer, it allows you to use salt more effectively. So soy sauce does a couple of things at once while also saving salt. But why save salt? It's not like it's expensive. Well, it isn't, but it was, for like the longest time. And that's an issue. I already said that salt was a universal need, but let's get into that for a moment. Every human, and indeed every animal and even plants, need salt. That is because of the way cells work. In the interest of not turning this into a lesson on biology, you can think of your basic cell as a container of liquid that can replicate and, at least in a larger body, interact with neighboring cells. One of the ways that interaction works is via the exchange of nutrients. For that, it is necessary that there's a certain amount of salt. By controlling the salt content in the cell, the exchange of nutrients can be facilitated. Neutrons also need specific concentrations of salt in order to send electrical signals from one to the other. And that's just the tip of the saltberg. Suffice it to say, all animals need salt. But wait a minute, if all animals need salt, and a significant number of animals lives miles away from the ocean or even the next supermarket, how do they get salt? Well, they have an instinct for finding it. Herbivores tending to lick salty minerals and rocks, and predators getting their salt from herbivores, who really seem to be stuck with all the work here. Indeed, even herbivores have been observed doing some pretty messed up stuff to find themselves some sweet salt. Memo to self, find better phrasing. But we're getting off topic. You may have surmised, and correctly so, that the amount of salt the body needs is absolutely tiny if you can get all you need from licking the side of a mountain. And that's true enough. An adult human needs less than a tablespoon of salt a day. You may also have noticed, by reading the nutritional information on the back of food packaging, which, granted, isn't as intuitive, that you consume a lot more than that in salt. And that's because humans use it for multiple purposes. To survive, sure, but also because it tastes nice, because it helps emphasize other flavors, and because it is a great natural preservative. Because of that, and the, frankly ridiculous, population size, humans needed to move away from sucking rocks for sustenance. To do that, different cultures came to different solutions. Europe, for example, has a lot of mineral salts underground, and there's even dried out saltwater basins similar to Salt Lake City that were discovered over time. These were easy to mine. Therefore, much of Europe's salt consumption and trade became reliant on salt mining. Generally speaking, Japan is a region very poor in mineral resources. The most famous example of this is probably iron, the generally poor quality of which, and the lack of furnaces with enough heat to melt the metal completely, led to the development and proliferation of the folded steel method that is characteristic of the katana or samurai swords, if you're not into that whole calling things what they are called thing. The point is, Japan didn't, and I suppose doesn't, have access to large underground sources of salt. But they do have large undersea deposits, or underwater, it's in the ocean. There's a lot of salt in the ocean, and Japan has a lot of ocean. And there are many kinds of edible algae, and when they dry, you can see the dry salt on the surface. According to a salt maker that I had the great opportunity to meet, that was how salt as a condiment was first discovered. Ancient Japanese people would collect and dry these algae and cook them with other food to pass on the flavor. Another source, the Tokyo Salt and Tobacco Museum, doesn't quite corroborate that story, but it doesn't contradict it either. Here, the algae were collected and put into pots with water, creating a salty brine which could then be cooked to evaporate the water, leaving the salt as a residue. As you can see, that is not quite the same process, and my guess would be that the history of the museum starts one step after the one the salt maker told me about. It certainly feels like a natural progression. But by this point, we've already arrived at an almost industrial process. Let's take a closer look at it. The algae are collected from the ocean full of salt water. Since they get their salt from the ocean water and not the other way around, no matter how many of these you stuff into a bucket of salt water, they're not going to raise the average level of salt content. But if you dry them out first, suddenly you have more salt than water in the algae. And since salt tries to spread evenly in liquid, which is also why it is needed for the nutrients in the cell, if you then put the algae into water or even seawater, the salt content in the water will rise. By doing that with a lot of algae, you can get the salt content quite high. If you then take the resulting brine and boil it down, well, first the salt content rises even more. But then the water evaporates completely and you are left with pure salt. But collecting algae and drying them out is sort of a weird in-betweeny step, and do they add additional flavor? I couldn't find anything on that, but I'd be surprised if algae were taste neutral. Back on point. Apparently, the ancient Japanese agreed with me, because they didn't stick with that method. Instead, several new methods were developed. Like the Algae method, which aims at creating a very salty brine, which is subsequently boiled down into a salt. It did so by replacing the algae with sand. That sounds counterintuitive. Let me explain. People would create elaborate sand fields, in which they have a relatively thin layer of sand over which they pour water and let it evaporate. As the water evaporates, again the salt remains. And by washing the sand, you can get the salt off it, again creating a highly concentrated brine. Basically, this is replacing the algae with sand, while also increasing the salt content before you create the brine. This has a couple of advantages. First, it doesn't taste as algae-y, but also, the sand is more flexible to handle. You can also attain it more reliably, as you aren't dependent on a growth cycle or even cultivation, since you can reuse the sand any number of times, while algae are liable to disintegration, rot and so on. But surely, that has to be ineffective, right? I mean, you have to get massive amounts of seawater to evaporate for days on end, only to dilute the salt in water again and cook the resulting brine. Actually, you boil it, cool it, filter the gypsum out of it, and boil it again before you have the final product. Surely it has to be easier to just cook the seawater directly into a brine, right? I mean, not really. Normal seawater, the kind of seawater you would buy at your local supermarket, is actually pretty low on salt. Around 3.5%, which is 3.5 grams per liter or some random number of ounces per gallon. That means you would have to heat an enormous body of water to get the same amount of salt you get from the brine. Larger bodies of water take space and more energy to fuel, so now you are dependent on 2 resources instead of 1. You need new laborers to cut and haul wood, but you still need all the same people to haul water and cook the brine and everything else. That's not even getting to asking how many places there are with access to ocean and a forest, whether you have to dry the wood before you burn it, and if you might, in the long term, use up more wood than can regrow in your immediate vicinity. So you have to get the wood from further and further away. Now you've got to keep all these things in mind, and at the end of the day, sure, you might be able to get the salt out of the water quicker, but you are only able to do so by escalating the labor you put into it. By letting the sun do a significant part of the heating work, the labor cost was cut down significantly. Just how effective this was is evidenced by the fact that they started to add additional steps to the process. The already salty brine was pre-condensed in separate vats before it was combined, still liquid, into the final boiling vat. That way, the large amount of brine could be cooked in separate smaller volumes, which made the cooking quicker. Only then was the remaining brine combined in the final cooking stage. At least that's how things used to be. But the methods for salt production kept developing. The salt fields, for example, developed different setups and even channeling systems for the water. But the Algae method isn't the only one that existed in Japan. Now, you may recall that I said I spoke to a salt maker, and I did. Actually, I did more than that. See, the place was a traditional salt maker, but one that used seawater directly to boil down into brine. This too made use of a similar process of multiple reductions by boiling the straight seawater in a first pot, then siphoning it off into a final boiling pot. Since this salt maker only had 2 pots, the first pot was used several times. Each time, the resulting brine was added to the final boiling pot, which was already cooking to get a nice salty brine going. It was awesome. The method used here developed more recently under the influence from Western cultures. It used Western-style rectangular iron pans or pots or vats, whatever you want to call them, called hiragama in Japanese. Compare this to the stone-light pans that had been used earlier. Instead of just leading the smoke away like previous methods, the hiragama used the heat of the smoke for the preheating pan, in which the salt water is first condensed before it is funneled into the crystallization pan, thereby reducing the labor cost for fuel. True, like the method we dismissed earlier, this is starting from seawater and boiling it directly, which is what the Saikan method tried to avoid. But there are a few reasons why this method made sense. On the one hand, it developed later, when labor costs for securing fuel were significantly reduced. It's also possible that this is a question of scale, as this particular salt maker was a family operation with only 3 people working there. It's possible that my other sources focused on larger operations. It's also possible that location played an important role here. The salt maker's hut was by a cliffside, right by the ocean in front of only a small sand beach with a high rock portion in that sand. There wasn't a lot of space to create an elaborate sand field in the immediate vicinity, at least not if you didn't want to carry the sand all the way uphill. And salt was quite expensive back in the day, which may have made even less effective methods of salt creation a profitable alternative. Finally, this method is independent of the weather. The second method is highly effective, but only while you have several hours of uninterrupted, reliable sunlight. Worse, a sudden change in weather can ruin a day's worth of work. Back on topic though, my contact afforded me some direct experience with at least this one specific operation, so I can get into some details here. In the morning, we get to the car and drive to the outskirts of the city. We drive uphill for a while until we crest the slope and the view opens up to a stunning ocean. On the other side, the ground declines more rapidly. As we descend into a labyrinth of narrow streets, we snake our way down until we reach a street running parallel to the ocean. We turn left. The ocean and a few meters of beach to our right, while the already steep slope to the left turns gradually into a cliff and begins curving towards the ocean. As the slip of land grows narrower, the houses become fewer and fewer until they stop completely. At this point, the cliffside has turned into an easily 15 meters tall wall. Just in front of that cliff, the saltmaker's hut is situated. It is a small wooden building with plumes of smoke rising from the open door. We are greeted by the saltmaker and his family and led into the hut. The interior of the hut is dominated by two pans. A higher, smaller preheating pan, in which the water is reduced before being funneled into the larger, slightly lower crystallization pan for the final boil. By the time we arrive, that water has been cooking for hours. A final brine is made by pumping salt water directly into the preheating pan through a filtered pump. Later, it is combined with the remaining brine in the larger crystallization pan. This brine, having boiled for hours already, is close to reaching its saline saturation point, and the water needs to be churned constantly to prevent the forming salt crystals from growing into one giant crystal. And so we stand in the hut with a thick white cloud of water constantly evaporating from the pan. So thick that, if the winds turn and the smoke fills the interior, it becomes utterly impossible to see. As we churn and churn, slowly keeping the boiling water moving while making sure not to cause any splashes, the brine turns, gradually, thicker and cloudier, turning positively grey as the wooden ladle makes its way through the water, its T-shaped end slowly being obscured from view. And then, so slowly that at first you don't see it if you don't know how to look for it, tiny little crystals form and begin to twinkle when the light hits them right. The older daughter gets a long-handled sieve and scoops a first, thin layer of salt from the brine, shining a light through it to demonstrate the purity of the salt. Then the churning becomes more crucial and harder, the water reducing with seemingly accelerating speed. More and more salt crystals form, and it becomes more important to scrape over the bottom and in the corners where the salt could sink and grow into a larger crystal. Still, the process takes hours. There's more and more salt in the water. Finally, there's only the piping hot salt, which is stirred one final time by the expert hand of one of the younger generation of salt makers. Finally, the salt, still steaming from the heat, is lifted between two scrapers into baskets of woven bamboo draped in cloth which can soak up any remaining liquids. The salt is still too hot to touch and needs to go through more drying before it can be packaged. But together with the father of the family, we try little pinches in the back room over a cup of tea. Meanwhile, his daughters prepare the salt for storage. They join us a few moments later. We talk about the day, the taste of the salt. It is complex, with every bit of the ocean flavor to it, as well as a warmth that is unusual to someone who's used to store-bought iodized salt. And we compare seashells and stones we found along the stunning rocky beach we explored in the moments when others were ladling. I was lucky enough to find a largish agate, but not as many nice shells as some of the others. These finds, however, are a meager collection compared to that of one of the salt makeresses. We were also shown to a flood cave, sadly littered with washed up garbage, where an ancient shrine is located. Large, black stains telling of ancient fires where the faithful set up their distinctly non-human sacrifices. Finally, we are given a sample packet of salt. Not the salt we made on that day, that still needs to cool and dry before it could be packaged, but we did get a large pack of it later. It is an amazing tasting salt and one that can be bought in the supermarkets of the area. So good in fact that I have still to use more than a few pinches, even though it has been well over 2 years, just because I haven't had many occasions where I thought it was worth using something as nice as that. Outside of the typical culinary uses, Japan has another use for salt that we don't in the West. This one is connected to Shintoism, where salt is said to have a purifying quality. This bit is in severe danger of getting out of hand, so I'm just giving you the abridged version here. Long short story, the idea of cleanliness is a major factor in Shintoism and purification rites abound. The most common thing used for this is water, which is, for example, what you use to purify yourself before entering a shrine. But there are other methods too, like sake, certain tree branches, and, in this case, salt. It can be hard to determine precisely where the symbolism for some of these older religious rites come from, and I certainly couldn't find anything concrete. But there are a few explanations that offer themselves. First, there was the simple fact that salt was expensive. So the use of salt could have signaled piety and/or wealth. But that is boring. Let's look at some other reasons. Well, there's the connection with ocean water. Salt is connected with water, another purifier, and it is also created from water in a process that could be seen as a form of purification. Salt is also white, which is an important Shintoistic color symbolizing purity. So while I couldn't find anything on the origins of salt as a purifier, it really ticks all the boxes symbolism-wise. That's why you can see it used in different rites, most significantly in the purification at the beginning of sumo matches. You may have noticed that sometimes the wrestlers take one handful of something and throw it over the ring. That's salt, and it's used to purify the ring before the match. Sumo started out as, and in many ways still is, a Shinto ritual. And as such, it was, and often is, held at shrines with all that entails. Also, yes, that means they are fighting on salt-covered ground. Barefoot. There are other salt-related traditions that might be connected to Shinto, but less clearly so. For example, many shops have a little plate in one corner with a pile of salt on top. These are supposed to bring good fortune to the shop, but details are unclear, like whether this custom is directly related to the purifying aspect of salt in Shintoism. Alternatively, it could stem from the fact that salt did used to be expensive, and that association might have led to the custom. A small sort of presentation of wealth to invite more wealth. So anyway, that is salt. There are more modern methods of producing salt, of course, but these are basically a more technologically advanced version of the same process of extracting it from seawater. It gets rather technical from here, as you might imagine. While there was some development of the production method toward a more automatic process, ultimately this developed into and/or was replaced by the ion exchange membrane dialysis method, which is a fancy way of saying these days we use electricity to first concentrate the ions in water and ultimately sieve the salt out more directly. The need for salt may be universal, but the ways we have made it are far from it. The way Japan compensated for its lack of salt mines allowed for a complex production and trade network to develop, which was fully capable to supply an entire country with salt. The Saikan method of sand filtering, which has survived to this day, has been designated a significant cultural property, and I will hold my time at the salt maker's hut dear for the rest of my life.